At 2:30 a.m. on October 14, 1942, Captain Dale Brandon lay face down in the mud of a foxhole on Guadalcanal, pressing his helmet into the dirt while the world ended around him. The ground wasn't just shaking, it was liquefying. The air pressure from the explosions was so intense it felt like someone was punching him in the chest every 4 seconds, that he wasn't being bombed by planes, that he wasn't being mortared by infantry, that he was being hunted by battleships. Out in the black water of the slot, two massive Japanese Leviathans, Congo and Haruna, were cruising casually up and down the coast like sharks circling a raft. They were firing 14-inch high-explosive shells directly into the airfield. These were shells the size of a Volkswagen, designed to punch through the armored belt of a heavy cruiser. Instead, they were landing on tents, fuel dumps, and parked aircraft. Each impact didn't just dig a crater, it deleted a grid square. The smell was horrific, a mix of burning aviation gas, pulverized coral dust, and the copper tang of sheer terror. For the Marines and pilots huddled in the mud, this was the absolute rock bottom of the war. They called this place the Canal, but tonight it felt more like a graveyard. They were starving, they were riddled with malaria, and they were completely cut off from the United States Navy. The Japanese owned the night. They could sail whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, right up to the beach. They called it the Tokyo Express, a nightly delivery service of troops, ammunition, and artillery shells designed to bleed the Americans dry. When the sun finally rose over the smoking ruin of Henderson Field, the silence was worse than the noise. Brandon and the other pilots of the 67th Fighter Squadron climbed out of their holes like zombies. They looked out across the airfield and saw a disaster. The runway was a moonscape of craters, half the planes were burning wrecks of twisted aluminum. The fuel dump was gone. The radio tower was a pile of splinters, and sitting there, miraculously, untouched in the middle of the carnage, were their own aircraft. They weren't looking at the legendary P-51 Mustang. They weren't looking at the fast, high-flying Corsair. They were looking at the Bell P-39 Airacobra. And every single pilot on that island hated it. The men who had to fly it. The P-39 wasn't a weapon. It was a bad joke told by a sadistic engineer. It was the Cobra. It was a clunker. It was the plane you gave to the squadron you didn't like. If you walked up to a P-39 on the tarmac, the first thing you noticed was that it looked wrong. It sat on tricycle landing gear with a nose like a child's tricycle, which made it sit flat and level while every other fighter in the war sat with its nose proudly in the air. It looked humble. It looked small. But the real problem wasn't how it sat, it was how you got inside. Every other fighter plane in World War II was a cockpit you climbed into. You slid back the canopy and hopped in like a race car driver. Not the Airacobra. The P-39 had a car door, a heavy steel frame door with a roll-down window just like a 1930s sedan. You didn't climb in, you stepped in, sat down, and slammed the door shut next to your shoulder. It made the pilots feel like they were trapped in a flying telephone booth. If you had to bail out in an emergency, you couldn't just slide the roof back and jump. You had to unlatch that heavy door and fight the wind pressure to kick it open. And if you didn't do it perfectly, the slipstream would slam the door right back into your face. But the door was just the wrapper on the problem. The real insanity was the engine. In a normal plane, the engine is in the front, pulling you forward. It's a heavy shield of steel between you and enemy bullets. In the P-39, the nose was empty. The massive Allison V1710 engine was sitting behind the pilot, right in the middle of his back. It was a mid-engine sports car designed in a world of pickup trucks. This meant the pilot was sitting in front of 1,000 pounds of screaming hot metal. To get the power to the propeller, a 10-foot-long steel driveshaft ran from the engine underneath the pilot's seat, directly between his legs, and up to the nose gearbox. When you throttled up for takeoff, that shaft would spin at thousands of revolutions per minute, whining like a dentist's drill inches from your femoral artery. It vibrated the floorboards. It made the stick shake. It was a constant mechanical reminder that you were sitting on top of a machine that wanted to hurt you. The design was supposed to be revolutionary. It was supposed to make the plane aerodynamic and agile. But the engineers in Buffalo, New York, had made a fatal miscalculation. By putting all the weight in the center, they made the plane unstable. It was twitchy. If you pulled back too hard on the stick, the P-39 wouldn't just stall. It would tumble. It would flip end over end like a falling leaf. When an Airacobra entered a flat spin, it didn't recover. The centrifugal force would pin the pilot against the door, making it impossible to escape. The plane would simply fall out of the sky, spinning like a frisbee until it hit the ground. The pilots at Guadalcanal had a grim saying about the Cobra. If the enemy shoots you down, you might live. If the plane decides to kill you, you're already dead. But the betrayal went deeper than the design.it went all the way to the budget watchers in Washington. When the P-39 was first designed, it was supposed to be a high-altitude interceptor.it was supposed to have a turbo, supercharger, a mechanical set of lungs that pumped compressed air into the engine so it could breathe in the thin air at 20,000 feet. With that supercharger, the Airacobra could have been a contender.it could have climbed with the zeros. But before the war started, some bureaucrat with a calculator decided the supercharger was too expensive and too complicated. They stripped it out. They neutered the plane to save a few bucks. The result was catastrophic. Below 10,000 feet, the P-39 was fast and manageable. But the moment you climbed past 12,000 feet, the engine suffocated.it wheezed.it gasped for AI or.it became a sluggish, heavy brick that struggled to stay airborne. This was a death sentence in the Pacific. The Japanese Zero fighter was a kite made of magnesium and paper.it was light.it had a massive wing, and it lived at 20,000 feet. The Japanese pilots would sit up there in the sun, looking down at the American P-39s crawling along below them like turtles in a soup pot. The Japanese could choose when to fight. They could dive, slash, and zoom back up into the stratosphere before the Americans could even lift their noses. The British Royal Air Force had been the first to figure this out. They bought a shipment of Airacobras in 1941, painted them in British camouflage, and flew exactly one combat mission. The British pilots landed, climbed out, and essentially said, "You can have these back." They rejected the plane entirely. They mocked it. They sent a memo to the Americans that politely suggested the P-39 was useless for modern combat. So naturally, the United States Army Air Forces took all the rejects and sent them to the one place where equipment went to die: Guadalcanal. The pilots of the 67th Fighter Squadron knew they were flying the garbage of the Allied war effort. They knew they were the laughingstock of the aviation world. They knew the Japanese pilots on the radio laughed at them, calling their planes slow boats. On the morning of October 14th, as the smoke cleared from the battleship shelling, the situation was clear. The Japanese were coming back. The Tokyo Express wasn't stopping. Intelligence reported a massive convoy of troop transports and destroyers heading down the slot to finish the job. They were going to land thousands of fresh troops right on the beach and push the Marines into the sea. Captain Brandon looked at his battered squadron. He looked at the P-39s. Sitting on the tarmac. They were ugly. They were heavy. They couldn't climb. They couldn't dogfight. If they went up to 20,000 feet to intercept the zeros, they would be slaughtered. It was a mathematical certainty. The handbook said the P-39 was an interceptor, but the handbook was written by men who weren't standing in a crater on a tropical island. Brandon and his pilots realized they had to throw the handbook into the trash. If they played the game by the enemy's rules, if they tried to be fighter pilots, they would die. They needed to change the game. They needed to stop looking at what the plane couldn't do and look at the one freakish, bizarre thing it could do. Because the P-39 had a secret. The engineers hadn't put the engine in the back just to be different. They had moved the engine to make room for something in the front. Something that didn't belong on an airplane. Something that belonged on a tank. Running right through the nose cone, occupying the space where the engine should have been, was the Oldsmobile T9 cannon.it. Wasn't a machine gun.it was a 37mm heavy artillery piece. It fired a high-explosive shell the size of a stick of butter.it was heavy.it was slow. And it was the only reason the Cobra was still in the fight. The pilots looked at the cannon. Then they looked at the ocean. And for the first time they stopped looking up at the sky, they started looking down at the water. To understand why the P-39 pilots stopped looking at the sky and started looking at the water, you have to understand the monster sitting between their ankles. The Oldsmobile T9 cannon was a freak of engineering. In 1942, fighter planes were supposed to have machine guns, fast buzzing weapons that sprayed a cloud of lead like a garden hose. A standard Browning machine gun fired 12 rounds every second. It relied on volume. It relied on luck. You pulled the trigger, sprayed the air, and hoped one of the small bullets hit something vital. The Oldsmobile T9 wasn't a machine gun. It was a slow-firing artillery piece. It thumped 3 times a second, filling the cockpit with toxic smoke and shaking the pilot's fillings loose. It jammed constantly, forcing pilots to wrestle a charging handle between their knees while flying at 300 mph. But it had one redeeming quality. It fired high-explosive shells. You didn't need to chew through a wing. One hit would vaporize it. The pilots of the 67th Fighter Squadron stared at the Tokyo Express running troops down the coast. The gears in their heads began to turn. They realized That everything they hated about the P-39, the heavy nose, the low-altitude engine, the slow-firing cannon, was actually a blessing in disguise. They had been trying to use the plane as a high-altitude interceptor, which was like trying to use a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. It was the wrong tool for the job. But if they took that sledgehammer down to the deck, down where the targets were slow and heavy, the equation changed. They discovered something strange about the P-39's handling. At 20,000 feet, the mid-engine design made the plane wobble and dance. But down at sea level, in the thick, humid air of the Pacific, that same weight distribution made the Airacobra rock steady. It didn't bounce in the turbulence. It tracked like a train on rails. The nose didn't drift when you fired the cannon because the engine weight in the center absorbed the recoil. It was the perfect platform for ground attack. It was a stable, armored gun carriage that could scream along the treetops at 350 mph. The first experiments were tentative. The pilots took their Cobras out hunting for Japanese barges. The Japanese Navy used hundreds of motorized wooden barges called daihatsus to shuttle supplies from their destroyers to the beaches. These were 50-foot boats packed with rice, ammunition, and soldiers. They were too small for a torpedo and too tough for machine guns. A standard .50 caliber bullet would just punch a neat little hole in the wood and the barge would keep floating. The P-39s changed the physics of the barge war. The pilots learned to come in flat, skimming the waves, lining up the silhouette of the barge in their sights. They would wait. They would hold their fire until they could see the faces of the Japanese crew. Then they would let the cannon eat. The results were horrifying and spectacular. When a 37mm high-explosive shell hit a wooden barge, it didn't make a hole. It didn't chip the paint. It detonated inside the timber. The first shell would blow the bow off. The second would ignite the fuel stores. The third would turn the entire vessel into an expanding cloud of splinters and spray. The pilots watched in awe as 40-foot boats simply ceased to exist in a single pass. They weren't chipping away at the enemy anymore. They were deleting them. The Cobra had found its teeth. The pilots started to walk a little taller. They painted shark mouths and jagged teeth on the noses of their planes. They weren't the victims of the Pacific anymore. They were the bullies. But shooting at wooden supply boats was one thing. Shooting at the Imperial Japanese Navy was another. The barges were undefended. The destroyers coming down the slot were floating castles of steel, bristling with 25mm anti-aircraft guns that could shred a P-39 in half. The escalation happened fast. The Japanese commanders were getting frustrated. Their barges were disappearing. Their supply lines were being cut by these strange, low-flying American pests. So they decided to bring in the heavy metal. Intelligence reported a massive run of the Tokyo Express. This wasn't just a supply mission. It was an invasion force. A line of destroyers was steaming south, their decks crowded with troops, their holds full of artillery. They were coming to retake Henderson Field. The order went out to the 67. Stop them. It was a suicide mission on paper. A handful of rejected fighters against a naval task force. The experts would have said it was impossible. You don't attack a destroyer with a fighter plane unless you have a bomb strapped to your belly. The P-39s didn't have bombs. They had the Oldsmobile. The pilots briefed in the mud. The plan was reckless. They weren't going to dive bomb. Dive bombing made you vulnerable. You hung in the air like a piñata while every gunner on the ship took practice shots at you. Instead, they were going to use the P-39's best trait, its inability to climb. They were going to stay low. They were going to fly in the weeds. They launched in the late afternoon, the heavy Allison engines screaming as they clawed for speed. They didn't point their noses toward the clouds. They leveled off at 50 feet, then 20, then 10. They flew so low that the prop wash kicked up rooster tails of spray from the ocean surface behind them. They hugged the coastline, using the dark green jungle as a backdrop to hide their silhouettes. A Japanese lookout on a destroyer. A plane flying at 10,000 feet stands out like a fly on a white ceiling. But a plane flying at 10 feet, painted olive drab, moving against a dark jungle shoreline. It's invisible. It's a ghost. The squadron tore down the channel, radio silent, eyes scanning the horizon. The heat in the cockpits was suffocating. The P-39 didn't have air conditioning. It had a drive shaft boiling between the pilot's legs and a tropical sun beating down on the greenhouse canopy. The smell of oil, sweat, and unburned powder filled the tiny cabin. Then they saw them. The shapes materialized out of the haze. The gray, angular profiles of Japanese destroyers cutting through the water. They were fast, sleek, and dangerous. White wakes trailed behind them as they zigzagged toward Guadalcanal. Above the ships, high in the sky, the pilots could see the tiny black dots of the Japanese combat air patrol, the Zeros waiting to pounce on any American bombers that dared to attack. The Zeros were looking up. They were scanning for dive bombers plummeting from the sun. They weren't looking down at the water. They didn't see the pack of Cobras skimming the waves, closing the distance at 300 miles an hour. The American pilots tightened their grip on the control sticks. They reached down and charged their cannons, feeling the heavy mechanical clunk of the bolts sliding home. This was the moment of truth. The theory was about to meet reality. Could a clown car airplane with a slow-firing cannon actually hurt a warship? Or were they just going to bounce sparks off the hull and get swatted out of the air? Captain Brandon broke radio silence. His voice was calm, flat, and devoid of fear that he gave a simple order. That would change Pacific doctrine forever. Line them up, boys. Aim for the waterline. Aim for the bridge and the gun directors. If they can't see us, they can't kill us. Blind them. The squadron spread out, forming a long, ragged line abreast. They were charging a wall of steel with nothing but aluminum and attitude. The Japanese ships grew larger in the windscreens. The pilots could see the white uniforms of the sailors on deck. They could see the gun turrets swinging around. The element of surprise was about to vanish. The executioner was knocking at the door. The distance between the P-39s and the destroyers evaporated in seconds. At 300 miles an hour, the world compresses. The horizon doesn't get closer. It expands. The gray steel shapes of the warships went from small models on a table to towering buildings filling the entire windshield. This was the terrifying reality of a low-level strafing run. There is no altitude to hide in. There is no cloud cover. There is just you, a pane of plexiglass, and 1,000 enemy sailors all looking at you and pulling triggers. The Japanese gunners were initially confused. Their manuals told them to look up at a 45-degree angle. They were trained to shoot at dive bombers falling from the clouds. They weren't trained to shoot at airplanes flying below the height of the ship's railing. For a few critical seconds, the anti-aircraft guns were pointed at empty sky while the Americans rushed in underneath their field of fire. But the confusion didn't last. The captains screamed orders and the heavy turrets swung down. The water in front of the P-39 suddenly erupted. It wasn't just bullets. It was a wall of water. Shells slammed into the ocean surface, throwing up geysers of white spray 50 feet into the air. The American pilots weren't just flying through flak. They were flying through a man-made storm. They dodged pillars of water strong enough to rip a wing off while keeping their sights locked on the gray steel hulls ahead. In the lead plane, the vibration of the engine shaft between the pilot's legs hit a fever pitch. The entire airframe hummed with potential energy. This was where the Cobra stopped being a joke and started being a predator. A normal fighter with the engine in the nose would be bouncing in the thick, turbulent air near the water. The nose would dip and rise with every thermal. But the P-39, with that heavy engine centered on the balance point, was a flying anvil. It didn't bounce. It cut through the turbulence. The nose stayed rock steady. The pilot lined up his shot. He wasn't aiming for the thick armor belt of the hull. A 37mm shell might dent that, but it wouldn't penetrate. He was aiming for the soft spots. He was aiming for the bridge, the glass windows where the officer stood. He was aiming for the gun turrets. He was aiming for the rudder controls at the stern. He had to be precise. He had to thread a needle while riding a rocket. At 500 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The cockpit filled with the smell of cordite. The big cannon kicked the plane backward in the air, a rhythmic sledgehammer recoil that felt like the aircraft was coughing. Thump, thump, thump. The tracers from the 37mm cannon looked massive compared to machine gun fire. They looked like glowing red baseballs floating through the air. They arced slightly, dipping toward the water before correcting and flying true toward the destroyer. The first shell hit the water short of the ship, skipping off the surface like a flat stone. The second shell didn't miss. It slammed into the superstructure of the destroyer right below the bridge. This wasn't a ping like a rifle bullet hitting a pot. This was a high-explosive detonation. The shell shattered the reinforced glass and exploded inside the command center. It didn't need to pierce the hull. It turned the officers' quarters into a blast furnace. A cloud of black smoke and orange fire burst out of the starboard side. The impact was devastating. The 37mm shell was designed to crack tanks. Against the destroyer's thin bridge plating, it was a wrecking ball. The high-explosive round detonated on contact with the command deck, shattering glass and filling the control room with smoke. The Japanese officers were thrown to the deck, but the American pilot wasn't done. He held the trigger down. The P-39 kept spitting fire. The next shell hit a 25mm gun mount. The anti-aircraft gun that had been spraying tracers seconds earlier vanished in a flash of light. The gunners were blown overboard, and the barrel twisted into scrap. The P-39 roared over the destroyer, clearing the radio mast by inches. The pilot glanced down and saw chaos on deck. Men running, fires burning, debris scattered everywhere. Then came the rest of the squadron. It wasn't a duel, it was a mugging. The P-39 swarmed the convoy from every angle. They didn't fly in neat formations. They attacked like wolves, hitting from the port side, the starboard side, and the stern. The Japanese gunners didn't know where to look. Every time they swung their guns toward one attacker, another Cobra raked them from behind. While the lead planes suppressed the destroyers, the trailing P-39s went for the real prize, the barges. The destroyers were the bodyguards, but the barges were the VIPs. Slow, wooden, and packed with soldiers and ammunition, they were sitting ducks. This was where the improvisation became annihilation. The pilots throttled back, slowing to gain precious seconds for aim. They lined up on the wooden boats. The 37mm cannon was overkill for plywood, but overkill was exactly what the Marines on the beach needed. One pilot walked his fire across 3 barges. The first shell hit the engine of the lead boat. The fuel tank ignited instantly. The barge didn't sink. It disintegrated. It became a fireball rolling across the surface, throwing burning wood and supplies hundreds of feet into the air. The second barge took a hit to its ammunition stores. The explosion was so violent it shook the P-39 overhead that a shockwave rippled across the water, capsizing smaller boats nearby. The slot turned into a junkyard. Burning oil slicks spread across the waves. Crates of rice, uniforms, and ammunition bobbed in the surf. Surviving Japanese soldiers leapt into the water, abandoning sinking craft. The P-39s kept coming. They circled back, reloaded, checked fuel, and dove in again. They dismantled the invasion force one boat at a time. High above, the Japanese Zeros were powerless. They circled at 20,000 feet, watching the destruction. They tried to dive, but the Zeros were built for altitude. At sea level, the air was too thick. Their engines overheated, their controls grew heavy, and by the time they reached the weeds, the P-39s were already gone, streaking away at full throttle against the jungle backdrop. The Americans refused to climb and forced the samurai to watch from above. Back at the surface, the destroyers were in trouble. They hadn't been sunk. It takes a torpedo to sink a destroyer, but they had been blinded and mauled, radar smashed, bridges shattered, decks burning. The so-called useless cannon shells had stripped away their ability to fight. The captains looked at the burning barges behind them, then at the damage to their own ships. They knew the mission had failed. You can't land troops if the transports are driftwood. Signal flags went up. The lead destroyers ordered retreat. The great gray ships turned slowly, carving wide arcs in the ocean as they withdrew north. They left soldiers in the water. They left supplies. They ran from planes the British had once dismissed as scrap. In the cockpit of the lead P-39. The pilot wiped sweat from his eyes. His flight suit was soaked. His hand cramped from gripping the stick. The cockpit floor was littered with heavy brass casings from the 37mm rounds. He checked his ammo. Emptied. He checked his fuel. Critical. He banked hard, left, looking back at the carnage. The Tokyo Express had been derailed. Smoking wreckage stretched for miles. He didn't feel like a knight of the air. He felt like a demolition worker finishing a brutal shift. The P-39 wasn't elegant. It didn't have the grace of a Spitfire or the power of a Mustang. It was an ugly, vibrating, mid-engine brute. But as the squadron formed up and turned toward Henderson Field, the truth was clear. The Cobra had done what no other fighter dared. It had gone nose-to-nose with a destroyer and won. They dropped their landing gear, the tricycle wheels locking into place, and headed for a cratered runway and a warm beer, leaving the Japanese Navy burning behind them. The clown car had the last laugh. When they touched down at Henderson Field, the silence was heavy. Ground crews rushed out expecting oil leaks and bullet holes. Instead, they found soot. The noses of the Airacobras were black with carbon. The ammunition bays were empty. The iron dog hadn't just barked. It had bitten deep. The mechanics looked at the empty bays, Then at the pilots climbing out with wild grins that no debrief was needed. The absence of enemy shells told the story. The Cobra hadn't just barked at it, had ripped the enemy's hand away. In the weeks that followed, the legend of the P-39 began to shift. The mockery didn't vanish. The pilots still cursed the cramped cockpit and the treacherous door, but the fear was gone. They understood the machine now. It wasn't an interceptor. It was a flying sledgehammer. They used it to smash barges, strafe troop columns, and terrorize shipping. Japanese infantry learned to fear the low, guttural thrum of the Airacobra's engine. They knew that sound meant high explosive death at treetop level. While Americans were learning to respect the Airacobra, the Soviets were already obsessed. On the Eastern Front, the war was a low-altitude street fight. Exactly where the P-39 thrived. Soviet aces like Alexander Pokrushkin ignored the manuals, used the cannon to tear apart German bombers, and turned the rejected American fighter into one of the deadliest aircraft in their arsenal. The experts in Washington and London had judged a fish by its ability to climb a tree. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor and received a low-altitude brawler. They called it a mistake. The pilots who flew it called it survival. After the war, the P-39s didn't get parades, they didn't get glory. The P-51 Mustang became the poster child of American aviation, the Cadillac of the sky, shiny and silver. The P-39s were mostly dragged into scrap piles. They were melted down to make aluminum siding for houses or cans for soup. They were ugly, they were weird, and they were forgotten. But looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see the P-39 for what it really was. It was the grandfather of the modern attack plane. It was the first time an engineer looked at an airplane and decided to build it around a gun rather than building a gun to fit on an airplane. That same philosophy would resurface decades later with the A-10 Warthog, another ugly, slow plane built around a massive cannon that the experts hated but the soldiers loved. The P-39 proves that paper stats don't fight wars. Physics fights wars. And on that specific day in Guadalcanal, the best plane wasn't the one that could fly the highest. It was the one that could fly the lowest, take a hit, and punch back. We rescue these stories because history has a bad habit of smoothing out the rough edges. We like to remember the perfect victories and the perfect machines. We forget the messy, desperate scrambles where men had to improvise with garbage equipment to survive. We forget the Cobras that held the line when the thoroughbreds were still in the factory. Captain Brandon and his squadron didn't win the war that day, but they bought the Marines one more night. They stopped the bleeding. They proved that a bad plane in the hands of a brave pilot is worth more than 1,000 blueprints in the hands of a bureaucrat. So the next time you see a picture of that weird little plane with the car door and the tricycle wheels, don't laugh. Don't dismiss it as a failure. Remember the sound of that 37mm cannon thumping away in the humid air of the Pacific. Remember the destroyers burning in the water. Remember the Cobra. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the misunderstood machines of World War II, make sure to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that you care about the history that usually gets left on the cutting room floor. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about the weapons, the tactics, and the men who broke the rules to win the war.